I think we have to finish up the second part of development today. And the second part of development, I think we need to sort of pass the material for today to the essay questions. Because already from the last class about development, there was a huge question, right? That emerged, huge question there regarding development issues. The big one from last class was the contrast. I mean, this chapter, development chapter, is devoted in most part to the Asian success, right? Development issue is much bigger than the success of Asian economies. It's a really broad topic. And development discourse is really shifting today after the financial crisis. So what we have to do today is maybe raise additional questions in addition to Asian success, raise more developmental issues. Then the last section of this chapter addresses like a more recent debate on development after the global financial crisis, after globalization, because the authors argue that the debate on development has shifted after globalization. So we need to understand today then where is development debate going today after globalization, how globalization changed the debate on development. And I mean, he also raises this issue of Asian success must be looked at from different perspective. So Asian success is no longer a success, right? Asian economies are in some troubles today. So we need to revisit those Asian tigers, including Korea, right? That's what is contained in the last section, right? So revisit Asian economies, including Korea. Then sort of shed sort of a new light on, right, development issues. So that's what we have to do today. And I want to first, sort of reiterate some of the points. The contrast between Latin America and Asian economies, right? You know that the contrast, right? Savings, right? Investment, and the role of the state, particularly the role of the state in Asian tigers and little dragons. Little dragons meaning those, smaller Southeast Asian economies, successful Southeast Asian economies. So Asian tigers, little dragons. The reason why they succeeded in economic development before globalization is that the role of the state was appropriate. It was a smart development strategy, right, planned by the government. Right? Whereas Latin America, why they underperformed as compared to Asian economies, number one reason in terms of economic structure, they rely more on raw materials and agricultural crops, right, rather than sort of like a non-resource-based economies in Asia, which is a blessing, right? I discussed that a little bit at the end, why resource abundance is a curse rather than a blessing? This is a huge research question. That was, I think, one of the biggest problems facing Latin America. Resource abundance was a curse. Second reason, ISI, import substitution. What is import substitution? Latin American strategy was ISI, right? What does that stand for? Import substitution industrialization, right? ISI in and of itself was to insulate, right? Insulate the economies in Latin America from foreign contacts, right? That is a bad thing. That was a bad strategy, right? The initial sort of assumption behind it, initial assumption behind ISI was to sort of protect, right, the infant industries in Latin America. So sort of it was a diversification strategy, diversification away from resource industries, right? Then grow industrial sectors, right? That's I think the key to ISI, right? How to diversify from resource industries and to make a transition to industrial sectors, right? That's I think one of the biggest challenges facing Latin America at that time. But they failed to grow manufacturing industries, right? And then they remain as a raw material supplier. That was the problem for Latin America, right? And they became heavily indebted, right? Heavily indebted. And there was corruption, right? Corruption was there. And government plan, much more inappropriate than Asian economies. Right? Government plan, government role was inappropriate than in economies, than in Asian economies. Right. In Asian economies, it was export-led strategy, export-led growth, and right, export-led growth began with some specific, like labor-intensive, right, labor-intensive basic industries, right, then moved to much more capital-intensive industries, like a chemical industry, petrochemical. So we Koreans, for instance, Korea, Taiwan, we began with very small industries, labor-intensive, like a shoemaking, right? Shoemaking, like a textile making. That's how we began, right? Then 70s, we moved on to much more heavy industry type of sectors, like steel industry, petrochemical industries, right? Then automobile industries. That's the 80s, right? Maybe 70s, late 70s, early 80s, right? Those in the steel was very important, right? There was a important figure, again, Park, Mr. Park, right? Pohang, right? Who exercised great leadership in catching sort of some niche market in the global steel industry, right? He saw some possibility of Korea, right, doing important role in the global steel industry, which was a right decision at that time. And petrochemical industry. Petrochemical industry, do you know what petrochemical industry is? What is petrochemical industry? Korea was big on that, right? 30% of the Korean economy, 30% of Korean revenue, Korean income comes from petrochemical industry. What is petrochemical industry? like GS Caltex, right? GS Caltex, SK, formerly Yugong, formerly Yugong, and we have many companies like that, like 석유화학, right? In Korean, it's 석유화학, Caltex, right? Those companies, we have many of them from the 80s. The 80s, 90s, best times for these industries. And Korea made a lot of money. What is petrochemical? What do all these companies do? Not many people know. Hmm? Right. When Saudi, right? When Saudi Arabia and Oman, Kuwait, these countries dig up raw oil, right? Very thick, black, right? Raw oil. Then they ship it. Then they ship it to Korea, like Ulsan, those southern parts of Korea. Then we import this raw oil, right? Crude oil. Then we process them. These petrochemical, factories process them. When they process it chemically, then it turns into different petrochemical products, like plastics or textiles or vinyl, right? Everything like this comes from crude oil. Plastics comes from crude oil, and many items we use daily, products of this petrochemical processing, right? Koreans, I don't know how we became good at these kind of work, but somehow Koreans learned this technology and made a lot of money. And we sell these products, right? This is oil-based, right? So Korea made some role between Saudi Arabia, right, as oil producer, then final product consumers like Europe, America, these advanced countries, right? So Korea is in between, right? We do some work for oil-producing countries, right? In so doing, we made a lot of money. That is coming to an end now, right? Because, again, shale gas. The shale revolution means that countries and many companies no longer use these oil-based petrochemical materials, right? Because gas is cheaper than crude oil, right? So what will become the norm in the future will be not petrochemical, not oil processing, but gas processing industries, right? So these products, basic products, are made not out of crude oil, but out of natural gas, right? That's the meaning of shale gas revolution. So a lot of Korean companies now, petrochemical industry companies, their incomes cut in half because of this. Because America has become the center of this gas processing. Louisiana, the southern part, the Gulf Coast area in America, a lot of companies are relocating in the Louisiana area. And they make it gas processing products. So Korea is losing in this game, in this new energy game. So we have to, a lot of these 석유화학, these petrochemical Korean companies, they are like, they're making new strategies to survive in this shale revolution age. Right? So petrochemical industry, steel industries, then automobile, then semiconductor, IT technology, right? That's how Korea developed. Korean industry evolved. Now, what I want to say today is, to to complement this chapter a little bit, we need to, I mentioned this last class, we need to divide countries into several groups to better understand development. Because the focus of this chapter solely is on Latin America, Asia, right? Then highlight Asian economies. But we need to add in this group. I think already this chapter includes like we have number one group, like a very poor, right? And some of them even failing states. So for these countries, I think development issues are different than, right, issues facing Korea and Taiwan and others. So number one group we need to think about is those countries that are suffering from abject poverty, right? So African countries or some former Soviet, right, republics, Central Asian countries. So this number one group, right? Second group, Russia, China. Second group, Russia, China, which is absent from this chapter. So again, the question here is, you know, the countries like Russia, countries like China, what kind of development strategies? How did Russia get out of the stage of the communist planned economy? Right? What's the difference between Russia and China? Right? And what are the development challenges facing Russia today? Right? And China is a very interesting country from development perspective. Right? Very interesting. If you search newspaper articles and magazine articles about China these days, there's a drastic shift in focus regarding China. A lot of analysts talk about the crisis, potential crisis in China. Right? So we might see China some years down the road, right, suffering a very serious economic crisis. And how about Russia? Right? Putin is facing a huge problem in managing the economy. Right? I don't think Russia is a market economy. Right? And I don't even know how to define, how to classify Chinese economy. Right? These are all hybrid economies, neither market nor, right, planned or completely 100% non-market economies. So Russia, China, second group, very important group. And third group, which again this chapter doesn't include. The third group there are a whole bunch of really resource exporting countries, like Saudi Arabia, right, Middle Eastern countries, and countries in North Africa, many in North Africa, like Algeria, Libya, right, Egypt. They are all resource abundant and resource dependent countries, right? So what are the development challenges for this group of countries, right? Middle East, North Africa, MENA, MENA, Middle East, North Africa. So this is a separate group, and again, there's a serious problem there, right? Then Latin America, Asia, maybe. So out of all these different groups, I mean, there is reason why this chapter compares and contrasts Latin America and Asia, because Latin America and Asia most comparable out of all these different groups, right? Would you like to compare Korea to African countries? No. Would you like to compare the Korean economy to the Russian economy? No. Starting point is different, very different. But some similarity, most comparable group is maybe Latin America and Asia. I think this chapter, the way this chapter, the last section of this chapter in terms of how development debate evolved after globalization, right? Because he argues that clearly development discourse has changed after globalization and financial crisis. Financial crisis meaning not 2008. Financial crisis, 1997. 1997 is the important turning point in the development debate, right? You know, Thailand, crisis in Thailand, right? Spread out to, right, Korea, Turkey, Russia, many developing countries in these different groups, right? Many developing countries, not American economy, not European economies, all developing economies in different groups, they suffered, right? They suffered some sort of financial crisis, 1997. And this chapter rightly points out that crisis, 1997, was a huge turning point in redefining development. Right? Now, let's discuss then how did 1997 crisis change the development debate. Number one change after 1997 is Washington consensus. Washington consensus, which is neoliberal prescriptions, right? Structural adjustment programs, things like that, right? These IMF-led, right, Western economists prescribe, right, economic programs for development began to be reassessed. That's number one change, right? So Washington consensus began to change. In other words, many people began to criticize the Washington consensus. What are the new then perspectives that added to the conventional Washington consensus perspective? Washington consensus perspective, which is neoliberal, right? Extreme neoliberal perspective. The way they see the economy is they look at from financial perspectives, right? Financial perspectives, macroeconomic focus, right? Price is important, inflation is important, right? So in terms of diagnosing, right? Assuming that developing economies in the developing countries, they are patients, okay? They are ailing, right? They have problems, right? They are patients. Then doctors from Western countries or IMF, they first diagnose these patients, right? Then there are certain things they look at first. What are these symptoms they look at first? From Washington consensus perspective, that's macroeconomic perspectives, right? Inflation, budget deficits, right? So Washington consensus have its own had its own perspectives, very narrowly defined, right? Narrowly defined economic perspective. That's Washington consensus. So after 1997, many people began to realize these narrowly defined economic perspectives were wrong, right? So doctors, they misdiagnose the patients. The patient's clearly sick. That's true. Patient's sick, right? But the prescription was wrong. These Washington doctors, they misdiagnosed because the symptoms were not quite macroeconomic, right? The symptoms were not quite inflationary problem or budget problem. Well, the symptoms were much bigger than macroeconomics or budgets or inflation, right? Because we learned that, right? What comes, in the list of Washington consensus structural adjustment programs, the list, right? There's the laundry list of right things that they have to restructure, right? Inflation, budget, prices, getting the prices right? Prices, right? Budget cuts, things like that. But there is the other way of looking at the economy, right? So doctors from other groups, not Washington groups, these doctors see patients from different perspectives. Like what they see is first, after 1997, the schools of economics that became much more fashionable than this macroeconomic group, Washington Consensus Group, are so-called institutional economics. Institutional economics became much stronger than Washington Consensus Group. Institutional economics, much more fashionable after 1997. Then what is the school of institutional economics? How do they look at the economy or economics differently? They have different views. When they diagnose patients, they see differently. They would rather look at the body, the general structure of the body, rather than specific inflation problem or macroeconomics. They look at the body itself, institution first, right? They look at the institution first. That's institutional economics. At the end of this chapter, Jeffrey Sachs is mentioned. Jeffrey Sachs. Jeffrey Sachs is mentioned, is pointed sort of as representing this institutional economics. Jeffrey Sachs represents institutional economics, the school of institutional economics. What did he say in this chapter? Jeffrey Sachs was hired by the UN Secretary General as planning some programs for the MDG, Millennium Development Goal. Millennium Development Goal is sort of a program for these new challenges for developing countries after 1997. Right? And Jeffrey Sachs represents institutional economics. What he emphasizes here is he talks about clinical economics. Clinical economics. And what else did he say? In other words, economists must be much more clinically oriented. It must become like doctors, real doctors, good doctors. And those doctors are dispatched to monitor, observe, and teach developing countries. Right? And give out correct prescriptions. He wrote a very famous book, Jeffrey Sachs, End of Poverty, right? In the 2000s. In the 1990s, Jeffrey Sachs, his major work was on advising former Soviet economies, Russia, Poland, right? And Jeffrey Sachs is known as those clinical economists, even from the 1990s. Poland, right? Many Eastern European economies, right? He went there, right? Then advised the leaders in those former Soviet economies. And he also advised Latin American economies. And his focus shifted to African countries in the 2000s. When he began to work for the United Nations, his project is, like the title suggests, how to end this abject poverty-ridden countries in Africa. A little bit different challenges, right? Challenges and recommendations he gave to the leaders in former Soviet economies and African countries very different. Right? And regarding Africa, he emphasizes clinical economics more. Clinical economics more important for African countries. Right? And what else? He also mentions right, he criticizes Washington consensus economists, like they were belt tightening, right? Group budgetary, obsession, and these prescriptions were particularly wrong for African countries, right? That's the point. These Washington consensus recommendations so mismatched, right? There's no fit for African countries. African economies, they want something else, right? It's still clinical, right, prescriptions, but very different from Eastern European countries, right? And he says economies are complex systems. Jeffrey Sachs is a very good speaker. I saw him. I met him. Very good speaker. I mean, the best speaker ever seen. Best speaker. His voice and the way he delivers his speech is the best speaker I've ever seen. And he's smart, right? He's smart and policy-oriented. And he argues, right, economies are complex systems. I think this is a very frank revelation that he sort of indirectly criticizes all the IMF economists that advised Asian economies, including Korea, in the 1990s, and Latin American economies. Right? Complex systems. Right? Complex systems and differential diagnosis. I mean, he says everything here. Differential diagnosis. Right? Different economies require different diagnosis. What does that mean? Formerly, IMF economists, they didn't distinguish different economies. Every economy, same. Every economy, same. They treated every economy same. That was a huge mistake. Huge mistake. Like Korean economy, African economy, Polish economy, those structural adjustment economies, they handled them in the one bracket same. They treated them same. No difference. As far as economics is concerned, every country same. That's the assumption, analytically. And Jeffrey Sachs now argues that, wow, that's a huge mistake because every economy has its own institutional structure, right? And history, historical development, different, right? This is a very important, I think, fundamental starting point. Attitude, philosophical attitude, right? This was one of the debates we were having in 1997 when IMF economists instructed the Korean government to follow such and such, right? Typical, right? Time-tested, right? Policies, like a reduced budget deficit, right? Fire workers, right? Government budget deficit most important, reduce inflation, right? And balance macroeconomics. These were typical, right? Time-tested prescriptions. And we accepted, Korean government accepted, right? We suffered tremendous social costs because of this, right? Many workers in different countries, different companies, they were fired, right? They had to accept it, right? And companies, public companies sold, right? Banks, like traditional banks, like public banks like Waehwan, foreign exchange banks, or commercial banks, they have been sold to hedge funds, right? What was the name of hedge fund? Lone Star, right? The hedge fund giant Lone Star, they merged big Korean, right, public bank, and there was the argument at the time, right? Was it a right decision, bad decision, right? And many other companies were sold, privatized, so-called, right? And now he says, right, these were probably misdiagnosis, right? Latin America, same, right? But every economy has different dynamics, right? So that they might need different, right, solutions. Now, this is more important when he advises right, African economies. Right? Institutional economy. This is exactly what institutional economists do. This is their assumption, right? And Jeffrey Sachs and many other, there are many economists in this school of economics. Now, so there's a revisit of Washington Consensus and the rise of institutional economics. Right? That's first change. The second change. The second change is the way aid is extended, right? The way foreign aid is extended has changed, right? In other words, there's a change from macro credit to microcredit. That's second change. The argument about this credit or aid is, we discussed this already. There are two ways of poor and developing countries can be funded in terms of economic development. First is foreign investment or foreign aid. Either one of these two ways, because they need money to, right, develop the economy. And countries like African countries, right, in the much poorer group, they tend to rely more on economic aid from advanced countries, right? Because the role of aid is much more important for poorer group. The question is, despite the enormous amount of economic aid from advanced countries, again, many Western economies began to raise the question of, despite the enormous amount of aid, why these developing countries, right, remain poor? Right? What happened to all this, aid coming from Western countries? That's the sort of a starting point, right? Then they began to think whether or not the aid system is right or wrong. The way, World Bank is in the lead, right? World Bank extends, a lot of economic aid. So people began to look at the aid system again, right? Reassess the aid system. And they have found there's a huge problem in the aid system, particularly the aid system led by the World Bank, right? And the new solution, even the argument comes for abject poverty group like African countries, right? There's the book. There's the book titled Aid Trap, right? Aid Trap, meaning for African countries, Western aid is a real problem for poverty, right? Because aid is like resources. The role the aid played in African countries almost like resource abundance, resource trap, right? So we need to restructure the extension of aid system, right? The aid system must be structured in a way that the aid really trickles down to grassroots group rather than to the leaders or elite, right? So the aid, Western aid, doesn't trickle down to really the people who really need them. That's the real problem, right? Otherwise, it makes these African countries much more corrupt, right? And the World Bank itself, problematic, right? So both sides, right? Recipients, World Bank, they both have problems in running this aid system. World Bank, again, their problem is World Bank reaching out to Western governments, right? Western countries. The Western countries collect money and giving to the World Bank, right? But the World Bank, they don't care about whether or not the money really used for those really people who need them, right? Once they give it, once they extend it, they don't care. So there has been a lot of discussion about this, right? And the book, there's a famous book, The White Man's Burden. William Easterly, he discusses that, right? Really famous book. That is really the book that sort of changed our conception about Western aid. So then, hence the conception of microcredit, right? So the aid system must be much more like, rather than macro, micro type of credit, right? Then in the Southeast Asian country, there was a leader there, Grameen Bank. So this is second change, right? Aid system, restructuring aid system is important. I don't know what's going on about this microcredit system currently. Again, we need to look at it again. Now, the third change is the notion about the developmental state. That's the third change after 1997 financial crisis. Now, again, we come back to countries like Korea and Asian tigers, right? This textbook takes the example of, again, famous report about the developmental state. 1993, IMF released a very famous report on Asian economies, right? Titled The East Asian Miracle. The East Asian Miracle. That was in 1993. Right? It was like a praise for Korea, Taiwan, these countries, right? Why are these countries successful, right, compared to Latin America, right? Then key factor was the state, developmental state, right? The state leaders were so enlightened, right? Bureaucrats smart, right? They plan ahead and lead, right, the economy, in the right direction, right? So that's the tone of the report, the East Asian Miracle, right? developmental study. Many people read it, right? To learn the secrets of Asian success. Right? Then we had IMF crisis, 1997. Then revisiting this East Asian miracle. Then the issue, I think that this is all due to globalization. Financial globalization in particular. I think that challenges for Asian countries, including Korea, Taiwan, and others, after 1997, is that development strategy is no longer simple, right? Very complex, right? Sometimes options are contradictory. What changed after IMF crisis was that it's a very cruel reality in which Korea, countries like Korea, had to decide whether to open up the economy, right? In terms of first, the lesson from the IMF crisis was, we did a good job of like a sort of a, in the 80s and 90s, clearly we did a good job of jump-starting the economy, right? But once we jump-start the economy, we couldn't move on, right? We sort of faced a huge problem there. And the reality was either we need to open up, right, in terms of receiving foreign investment, and trade. We need to sell more, right? FTA, through the form of FTA. Or we need to have more investment into stock market, Korean stock market, right? So this is a very stark choice between, right, complete financial open, right, then FTA, free trade. The debate we had in Korea is really foreign investment and FTA are solutions to all the problems facing Korea. Even today, we had very bad, times of like the whole society is completely divided over this issue, right? And we had American beef issue, right, under the former president. So development challenge facing Korea, I think, comes down to this issue of whether to open up or what's the best mix of trade policy or foreign investment policy, right? And Professor Chang, Ha-Jun Chang, he represents a certain ideology, right? He represents certain ideology. He's known as a scholar who sort of invented the developmental state theory in the 1980s, right? But now he became a representative of anti-globalization, anti-FTA, anti-foreign investment sort of a group in Korea, right? So now I think the development challenge for Korea is to find a optimum balance between these two options, right? And society is divided, right? I don't think Professor Chang Ha-Jun is 100% right. I don't think conservative ruling party, the policies they represent, are 100% right. I think the answer is somewhere in between. And we need to derive some consensus over these issues from society. That's important. That is important. Russia and China. Where are these two countries going? That is interesting issue. Although that is not mentioned in this chapter. Russia and China. They're very unique kind of economies, right? Different from Korea, different from Latin America. They face, again, unique developmental challenges. Right? I think the way they exited from the Soviet communist economies were from the beginning very different. The way China exited the planned economies, the way Russia exited the planned economy, very different. Oftentimes we say they have different sequential problems. Like in the case of Russia, they reform the political system first, while holding the economics, right? In the case of China, right, they holding politics, reform the economics first. The outcome was so different. Right? As you know, Chinese economic reform so successful. Again, right? When you assume that these two countries are comparable, right? The question is, why did Russia fail? Why did China succeed? Right? What are the factors behind these two, right, diverging outcomes? Maybe first reason, sequence. Right? China, economic reform first. Politics, still communist, technically. Right? Russia, political reform first. Economic reform followed. And the outcome, Russian reform process, so disastrous. Until Putin came in. So disastrous, right? Throughout the 1990s. There are many other reasons, right? But sequence is important. Another difference between Russia and China. Again, like in the case of Latin America, Russian economy in principle, if you look at the structure of the Russian economy is so resource dependent. That's really a serious problem. Very different from China, resource dependent. There's almost no manufacturing industry whatsoever to rely on. So the challenges, developmental challenges facing Russia, even today, also in the 1990s, also in the 2000s, today, the biggest developmental challenge facing Russia is how to diversify the economy away from resource-based economy to manufacturing-based industry. That's the biggest challenge. It's very difficult to change. Same as in Latin America, right? Tell you how dependent Russia is on resources. 50% of Russian revenues comes from energy exports. Okay? Energy exports. Saudi Arabia, 90%. 90%. A little bit better, Russia case, right? Better. 50% from energy exports. Out of 50%, 80%, oh, maybe I can ask this question. Within energy, right? Within energy, there are many different items, right? Broadly speaking, there are two big items in energy, right? Oil, natural gas. Which do you think bigger in terms of incomes for Russia? Natural gas or oil? Natural gas? Oil, much bigger, 80%. 80% oil. It's different from media reports, right? The image you get from the media reports about Ukrainian crisis, everything, Russia will almost collapse if Russia can reduce natural gas exports, right? No. Russia has oil. Oil is bigger income than natural gas. Much bigger income. 80% comes from oil exports. Only 20% comes from natural gas. Very different from the image you get from the media. What does this mean? What this means is Russia, you know the problem between Russia and America, right? The current row over Ukraine is Russia take hostage, right? Take Europe hostage over natural gas exports, right? Because Europe imports 45% of natural gas from Russia, right? Europe is divided, very different. Western Europe, relatively open. Western Europe, if you look at the western side of Europe, you have UK, right? And the northern Europe, like Norway, Sweden, Finland, all these countries, it's like they have a lot of ports in the western side, right? So these countries still rely on Russian natural gas imports, but much better than the Eastern Europe in terms of geography, because they can import LNG from different countries. So Western Europe relatively free from Russian natural gas exports, right? But still high, but better, relatively better. Eastern Europe is really dependent on Russia. Sometimes 100%, 90%, 80%, right? So this dividing line between Western Europe, Eastern Europe over this energy issue, we call it the Berlin Wall of energy, right? Political Berlin Wall came crumbling down almost 25 years ago, but energy war still remains. So the debate now is on how to break up this energy war. That's the issue today. So what this means is Russia has only 20% from natural gas. What this means is America, Europe, they're debating how to put pressure on Russia, right? Right? Extend sanctions on Russia. But that sanction might not work. Because if you look at this, right, structure of income structure, Russia, Gazprom, right? Even if America blocks like Russian imports into Europe, Russia natural gas company Gazprom can still survive as long as they can export oil. Right? Much bigger import. And oil price, much higher. $110. Today, $110. And natural gas price, when you adjust natural gas price is 1/15 of oil price. Right? Only 1/15. So as long as oil price is high, Russia and Gazprom still survive. So what Americans are discussing now is whether or not they can reduce oil prices. That's the final weapon. they can use against Russia. Did you know one of the quiz questions? Do you remember one of the quiz questions? Regarding the new Cold War. Do you remember that? Number one, the Reagan administration reimposes bipolar structure, modernizing nuclear arsenal, arms control talks abandoned, right? The fourth item is oil price collapse. Oil price collapse. Then what happens? The Soviet Union, the Soviet economy, crisis. Soviet economic crisis. Then, do you remember Gorbachev? Do you know Gorbachev, the Soviet leader at that time? He makes peace proposals to Western Europe countries. Let's sort of put down weapons, right, and discuss. Why did he do that? Yeah. Yes, Russia has become very defensive because oil price structure has become totally restructured. And who did it? America did it at that time, 1984. So I think the real cause behind Soviet collapse, 1991, is oil price collapse in 1984. That's the real reason, fundamental reason, right? So, everything else is just supplementary, like a multi-ethnic conflicts or Soviet economic, mismanagement, or, whatever. All these are just supplementary. The basic fundamental is oil price collapse, 1984. And the Reagan administration, he engineered that oil price collapse. America can't do that. But America needed the support of Saudi Arabia. Without Saudi Arabia, Reagan alone cannot do that. Because Saudi, the role of Saudi, the most important role Saudi can do is so-called excessive oil production. $3 million excess, right? In other words, they don't put them on the market. $3 million, they hold it, Saudi, because they have enough, right? So they hold it. Then when America gives instructions, Saudi put them on the market. $3 million barrels of oil, overnight, put them on the market, oil prices go down. That's what they did, 1984. Then the Soviet Union began to have reduced income, significantly reduced income. Gorbachev, he didn't have any money left to manage the country. Right? Then he became peaceful, right? Peace proposals, right? Then collapse. Same thing. Compare 84 today, same, very similar. Putin, he's in big trouble. Big trouble. And huge contrast, sharp contrast, Putin today and Putin several years ago, very different. And the one thing, everything else same, right? Other conditions same. The only thing that changed is oil price and natural gas situation. And the point, the Russian economy, big developmental challenge is to, like I said, the fact that Russia has a lot of oil and a lot of natural gas is a blessing, right? But at the same time is a real curse. 왜 그래? So Putin, Russia, right? the fact that they have oil and natural gas is a good thing, but always Putin has this cyclical problem of, right? So the lesson Putin should get from this Ukrainian crisis is, unless he reforms the economy away from resource dependence, I think the prospect for the Russian economy is very dark. No future. That's the difference between Russia and China. China has other problems. China doesn't have resource dependence problem, but China has other problems. Corruption. We have that problem too, corruption. You know what? Why Asian countries compared to Western civilization? Why Asian? I mean, someone earlier said, some scholars, define the century of 21st century as the century of right, the rise of Asia. We still have to see whether this is true, because the big difference between Western countries and Asian countries. Western countries prospered for the last 500 years, right? Maybe time is coming for Asian countries in the upcoming 500 years, but before we resolve this, the big difference between West and Asia is this corruption problem. We Asian countries, they have something in common, which is corruption. China, Korea, many other countries. I'm not sure about Japan, but this is a big problem for Asian countries. Problem for democracy, democratic development, and economic development. Right? The thing that gets in the way of real Chinese economic advancement is corruption. Right? If you read newspaper articles online, there are many scholars that propose these scenarios of Chinese economy collapsing. And nobody discusses the decline in American power. Right? The debate on declining America has almost disappeared these days. So I think that energy plays some role. Right? America made a huge breakthrough in energy technology. Because if you look at the Cold War history, right? Many events, ups and downs in Cold War history was over energy issues. Still same. Right? America had a huge breakthrough on this issue of energy. That's why America can advance. Right? And Russia, very opposite. Right? Russia, very prospect for Russia is very dim. China, again, we had very good, we thought that China, will be leading, right, the 21st century, but there are many warning signals now. So we need to carefully observe what will happen. Balance of power may be very different in the coming years. A lot of progress America is making in terms of balance of power regarding Russia, China, right? Over the last several years. Right after 2009 global financial crisis, America is making rapid progress in terms of power projection. Russia has become already very defensive, right? Almost in a crisis situation. China, better than Russia, but China is very much similar situation. Right? So very different dynamics of balance of power. That's Russia and China. And oil-producing countries, development challenges, the last topic. Development challenges for oil-producing countries like MENA, Middle Eastern countries, African countries. How about diversification for countries like Saudi Arabia? Could we expect some days when Saudi Arabia gives up on oil production, right? Then reform the economy, then develop some manufacturing companies, right? Exporting something. Can we, right, envision this kind of scenario for Saudi Arabia? But things are, I think, developing in a very interesting way. 1984, Russia, Saudi, American, Saudi, right? Sort of a cooperation brought down Russia. Now things are becoming very different. America is becoming energy independent, which means America no longer depends on Saudi oil, right? The Cold War structure, one of the pillars of Cold War era was oil security swap between America and Saudi Arabia, right? In other words, President Roosevelt, right, and Saudi King, 1947, right after Yalta meeting, they met. They signed some document according to which America provides security for Saudi Arabia against Iran and other Arabic countries. And instead, Saudi Arabia provides free flow of oil to America and American allies, right? That foundation continued until maybe today, or 9/11. And the current moment is a critical juncture where this American-Saudi sort of agreement on this oil security swap is changing. Because when America becomes energy independent, right? America no longer, still imports oil from Saudi, but in the future America might not, right, import from Saudi. Then why should America, right, keep engaged in the Middle East, right? Even as America is pivoting, America is rebalancing forces to Asia, to the Pacific Asia. And America is withdrawing from Iraq and Afghanistan. And America kept some distance from Syrian affairs some time ago, right? Syrian affair shows what American policy will be in the Middle East in the future, right? America is a different country now, right? The Syrian affair show, right, America might change the course in the future. Then all the questions, rise regarding then China will replace America in the Middle East. And Saudi Arabia, their strategy is also changing. One of the new strategy of Saudi Arabia is to rebalance their oil exports away from America, away from Europe to Asian countries, right? So, my point about development, right? Development facing Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia need to prepare for the future. Saudi Arabia might be facing a time when they no longer be able to export oil. Saudi knows that, right? Then as a country dependent on 90% on oil exports, right? How could they diversify their economies? This is also a problem for Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran. There are many other countries, right? So I think the Western countries particularly in America, they need to play some role in changing the economic structure of these formerly oil exporting, highly oil dependent economies. Right? We already see the Arab Spring, right? The Arab Spring political violence already coming from North African, Middle Eastern countries. So these problems might be spreading out in the Middle East, right? Because their incomes from oil exports might be reduced in the future, right? So what they have to do is to, right, diversify or develop new sources of energy, solar power. If you go to Saudi Arabia, right, they are putting a lot of money into solar energy development. Solar energy development. There are two ways of looking at it. Why Saudi invests in solar energy development? One is, number one way of looking at it is first, well, I mean, they are very future-oriented. They know that fossil fuel might be depleted, right, dry up someday. So they are prepared for future energy, such as solar energy. That's one way of looking at it. Second way of looking at it, well, I mean, they are very smart by developing solar energy, because Saudi economy, they're using more oil. Domestic consumption of oil is increasing. So by developing solar energy, using solar energy for domestic consumption and leave more oil for exports. That's the second way of looking at it. So it's not necessarily a good thing, right? The fact that Saudi invests in solar energy. So I mean, this literature of like development for oil exporting countries, this is a huge literature. There's a lot of scholars studying this. I'm one of them. So I think that's it. For next Tuesday, we'll shift to European Union, chapter 12. Okay.